The late afternoon sun hung low over the industrial district of Millfield, casting long shadows across cracked pavement and rusted chain-link fences. The air carried the smell of diesel exhaust and machine oil, the scent of a working-class neighborhood where people earned their living with calloused hands and aching backs. It was Tuesday, October 15th, and the temperature was dropping as autumn settled into the bones of this small Arizona town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Behind Miller's textile factory, tucked between a dumpster and a concrete loading dock, two small figures huddled together in the gathering dusk. Twin boys, 7 years old, identical in every way except for the different patterns of fear etched across their tear-streaked faces. Their school clothes were torn and dirty, their sneakers scuffed from running across rough pavement, and clutched between them was something that would haunt anyone who saw it. A woman's work identification badge, cracked down the middle and stained with blood. If you believe in protecting the innocent, in standing up when no one else will, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep these stories of courage and justice alive for those who still believe that good people exist in this world. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because brotherhood knows no borders, and kindness travels farther than we ever imagine. The boys were Diego and Miguel Vasquez, born 3 minutes apart on a cold February morning 7 years earlier. Diego came first, screaming his indignation at the world, followed by Miguel, quieter but no less determined. From their first breath, they'd been inseparable two halves of the same soul. Their mother used to say, "Where one went, the other followed." What one felt, the other felt twice as deeply. Their mother was Elena Maria Vasquez, 28 years old, with dark hair that she wore pulled back in a practical ponytail and hands that told the story of every job she'd ever worked. Cleaning offices before dawn, waiting tables during lunch rushes, stocking shelves at the discount store on weekends. But for the past 2 years, she'd found steady work at Miller's textile factory, operating one of the massive industrial sewing machines that churned out clothing for department stores across the Southwest. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was honest work, and Elena had been raised to believe that honest work carried its own dignity. Her shift ran from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., Monday through Friday, which meant she could be home when the boys finished school. She could help with their homework, make dinner from whatever was left in their small apartment pantry, and read them bedtime stories about brave knights and kind princesses and better days that were surely coming. Elena was a dreamer, but she was also a realist. She knew that minimum wage barely covered rent and groceries. She knew that her 1,998 Honda Civic was held together by prayer and duct tape. She knew that the boys needed new shoes and winter coats and school supplies that she sometimes couldn't afford. But she also knew that they were a family, and families take care of each other no matter what. The boys understood more than Elena realized. They saw how tired she was when she came home from the factory. They saw her counting and recounting the bills spread across their kitchen table. They heard her on the phone with the landlord, asking for just a few more days to make rent. They were 7 years old, but poverty has a way of aging children quickly, teaching them to be grateful for small things and never ask for more than necessary. That Tuesday afternoon had started like any other. Diego and Miguel walked from Millfield Elementary to the factory, a 15-minute route they knew by heart. Past the corner store where Mr. Chin always waved from behind bulletproof glass. Past the bus stop where their neighbor, Mrs. Garcia, waited with her 3 kids. Past the chain-link fence that surrounded the factory complex, with its loading docks and employee parking lot and the small concrete area where workers took their breaks. At exactly 4 p.m., they positioned themselves at their usual spot near the employee exit, backpacks at their feet, ready to walk home with their mother. They'd tell her about their day. Diego's success in math class. Miguel's art project that earned praise from Mrs. Rodriguez. Elena would listen to every word, ask questions, make them feel like their small victories were the most important things in the world. But 4 p.m. came and went, and Elena didn't appear at the employee exit. At 4:15, Diego checked the big clock on the factory wall. Maybe Mama's running late, he said, but his voice carried a note of uncertainty that Miguel caught immediately. At 4:30, Miguel stood on his tiptoes to peer through the chain-link fence into the employee parking lot. Elena's old Honda was still there, parked in the spot where she always left it. Her car's still here, he told his brother. She's still inside. At 4:45, they heard voices from somewhere behind the factory building. Men's voices, raised in anger, carrying across the concrete and asphalt like storm clouds gathering on the horizon. The boys looked at each other with the kind of wordless communication that only twins possess. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. They'd been told never to leave their waiting spot, never to wander around the factory grounds. But as the voices grew louder and more heated, fear for their mother overrode every rule they'd ever been taught. Diego grabbed Miguel's hand, and together they crept along the chain-link fence toward the back of the building, following the sound of conflict. What Elena had discovered 3 weeks earlier would change their lives forever. As she worked her station on the factory floor, she'd started noticing discrepancies in her paychecks, hours that didn't match what she'd actually worked, overtime that somehow disappeared between her timesheet and her paycheck. At first, she thought it was a simple accounting error, the kind of mistake that happens in busy offices and gets corrected with a polite conversation. But when she compared notes with other workers during lunch breaks, she realized the mistake was systematic. The factory management was stealing overtime wages from employees, forcing them to sign altered timesheets and pocketing the difference. For some workers, it meant the loss of $200 or $300 per month. For Elena, it was the difference between making rent and facing eviction. Elena Maria Vasquez had been raised by a grandmother who cleaned houses for wealthy families and never stole so much as a paperclip. Mija, her abuela, used to say, "Our hands may be dirty from work, but our hearts stay clean. We take only what we earn, and we earn everything we take." Those words had shaped Elena's entire moral framework. Stealing was wrong, no matter who did it or why. So Elena did what she'd been taught was right. She documented the wage theft carefully, keeping copies of her original timesheets and her altered paychecks. She researched the proper channels for reporting labor violations. And 3 days ago, she'd filed a formal complaint with the Arizona Department of Labor, detailing the systematic wage theft happening at Miller's textile factory. The complaint was supposed to be confidential, anonymous, protected by law. But in a small town where everyone knows everyone, secrets have a way of finding their way to the wrong ears. And when factory foreman Robert "Tank" Morrison learned that someone had filed a complaint against the company, it didn't take him long to figure out who had the courage or the foolishness to challenge the system. Tank Morrison was exactly what his nickname suggested: a massive man with shoulders like a linebacker and hands like sledgehammers. He'd worked his way up from the factory floor to management through intimidation and brutality, ruling the workers through fear rather than respect. The wage theft scheme had been his idea, a way to pad his own paycheck while keeping the workers too scared to complain. When Tank learned about Elena's complaint, he saw it as more than just a business problem. He saw it as a personal insult, a challenge to his authority that needed to be answered swiftly and decisively. He wanted to send a message to every worker in the factory. This is what happens when you cross us. At 5 p.m., as the day's shift was ending and the factory was emptying out, Tank and 2 of his supervisors, Jerry Kowalski and Danny Martinez, cornered Elena near the employee locker room. The conversation started quietly, almost conversationally, but quickly escalated when Elena refused to withdraw her complaint. "You think you're real smart, don't you?" Tank said, his voice carrying the kind of menace that made Elena's stomach clench with fear. "Think you can cause trouble for us without consequences?" Elena kept her voice steady, though her hands were shaking. "I just want to be paid for the work I do. That's all. What you're doing is illegal." "What's illegal?" Jerry said, stepping closer. "Is making false accusations against your employers. That's slander. That could get you in real trouble." "It's not false," Elena replied. "I have documentation. I have proof." That's when Tank grabbed her arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "Your proof ain't going nowhere," he said. "And neither are you, until we get this sorted out." Elena tried to pull away, but Tank's grip tightened. "Let me go. I need to get my boys. They're waiting for me." "Should have thought of that before you decided to be a hero," Danny said, moving to block the exit. What happened next would replay in Elena's mind for months afterward. Tank shoved her against the concrete wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. When she tried to scream, Jerry clamped his hand over her mouth. And when she fought back, all three men began hitting her with the systematic brutality of people who'd done this before. The beating lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like hours. Elena tried to protect her head, tried to stay conscious, tried to think about Diego and Miguel waiting for her outside. The men weren't just venting anger, they were sending a message. This is what happens to troublemakers. This is what happens when you forget your place. When it was over, Elena lay crumpled on the concrete floor, her work uniform torn and bloodied, her identification badge cracked where Tank had ripped it from her shirt and thrown it in her face. Through swollen eyes, she watched the three men straighten their clothes and walk away, talking casually about their dinner plans like they'd just finished a routine meeting. Elena lay there for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, trying to gather the strength to move. Her ribs ached where Jerry had kicked her. Her head throbbed where it had struck the wall. But worse than the physical pain was the fear for her boys, fear for her job, fear for what would happen if she tried to report this assault. Finally, Elena managed to pull herself to her feet. She stumbled through the factory, past the empty sewing stations and silent machines, toward the employee exit where she knew Diego and Miguel would be waiting. Each step sent waves of pain through her body, but the thought of her sons gave her strength to keep moving. She made it to the parking lot before collapsing. Diego and Miguel had been watching from behind the dumpster, their small hearts pounding as they witnessed something no children should ever see. They watched their mother stumble out of the factory building, watched her fall to the concrete, watched her lie motionless as blood pooled beneath her head. For a moment, both boys were frozen by terror and confusion. This couldn't be happening. This couldn't be real. Their mama was strong, was brave, was invincible in the way that all mothers are invincible in their children's eyes. But there she was, broken and bleeding on the cold pavement. And suddenly the world felt very large and very dangerous. Diego moved first, breaking from their hiding place and running to Elena's side. Miguel followed a heartbeat later, his small hands clutching his mother's cracked identification badge like a talisman against the horror of what they'd witnessed. "Mama," Diego whispered, his voice breaking on the word. "Mama, wake up." Elena's eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. She tried to smile, tried to speak, but only managed a weak moan that sent both boys into fresh waves of terror. "Mama's bleeding," Miguel sobbed, his 7-year-old mind unable to process the magnitude of what he was seeing. "Mama's bleeding real bad." Diego tried to remember what he'd learned in school about emergencies. Call 911. Find an adult. Get help. But his mother's cell phone was somewhere inside the factory, and there was no one else around, and he was 7 years old and didn't know what to do. That's when they heard a sound that would change everything. The rumble of a motorcycle engine, deep and powerful, cutting through the evening air like thunder rolling across the desert. The sound grew closer, and then a lone rider on a black Harley-Davidson emerged from the maze of industrial streets, his chrome handlebars glinting in the fading sunlight. The rider's name was Marcus Stone Rodriguez, though most people just called him Stone. He was 45 years old, with gray threading through his black hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many miles on too many roads. The patch on his leather vest identified him as Sergeant-at-Arms for the Hells Angels Desert Chapter, but the gentleness in his weathered face suggested a man who'd learned to balance strength with compassion. Stone had been riding these streets for 20 years, ever since he'd moved to Arizona after his discharge from the Army. He knew every back road, every shortcut, every corner where trouble liked to gather. And something about this empty factory parking lot, with its scattered debris and the smell of fear hanging in the air, set off every alarm bell in his head. He spotted the boys' first two small figures hunched over something on the concrete, their shoulders shaking with sobs that carried across the empty lot like breaking glass. Stone cut his engine and dismounted slowly, his heavy boots echoing against the pavement as he approached. What he saw when he got closer made his blood run cold. Elena was conscious but barely coherent, her face swollen and bruised, her clothes torn and bloodied. She was trying to comfort her sons even as she struggled to stay conscious, her maternal instincts overriding her own pain and confusion. Stone had seen violence before, too much of it in too many forms. But there was something about seeing a mother beaten in front of her children that ignited a rage in his chest that went beyond anger, beyond fury, into something primal and protective and utterly implacable. He knelt beside the boys, his massive frame somehow gentle as he assessed the situation. Years of military training kicked in check for immediate threats. Evaluate injuries, secure the area, call for help. Boys. His voice was rough but kind, the tone of a man who understood that these children had just witnessed their world explode. What happened to your mama? Miguel looked up through his tears, clutching Elena's badge like a lifeline. The bad men heard her, he said, his voice broken by sobs. They said she made trouble. But Mama's good. Mama's not trouble. Mama's good. Diego wiped his nose on his sleeve, trying to be brave for his brother. 3 men, he said. Big men. They came out laughing. They hurt Mama, and they laughed. Stone's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice calm. Can you tell me their names? Did your mama say their names? Tank, Miguel whispered. The big one was Tank, and Jerry, and Danny. Mama was scared of them. Stone knew those names. In a small town, everyone knew the factory supervisors, and their reputations for intimidation and cruelty were well established. What surprised him wasn't that they'd hurt someone, it was that they'd been stupid enough to do it in front of witnesses. Stone pulled out his cell phone and dialed 911 first, requesting an ambulance and police response. His voice was steady and professional as he gave the dispatcher their location and Elena's condition. But as he talked, his free hand was already scrolling to another number, a number that would set in motion a response that Tank Morrison and his cronies could never have anticipated. After hanging up with the dispatcher, Stone looked at the number on his screen for a long moment. What he was about to do would escalate this situation beyond anything the local police could handle. But looking at Elena, broken and bleeding, and her sons, traumatized and terrified, he knew there was no other choice. He pressed the call button. Reaper, Stone said when the call connected. We got a situation at Miller's textile factory. Working mother beaten unconscious in front of her kids for reporting wage theft. I need the chapter. All of them. The voice on the other end belonged to James Reaper Sullivan, president of the Hells Angels Desert Chapter. 62 years old, Vietnam veteran, a man who'd spent 40 years learning the difference between necessary violence and senseless cruelty. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority. How bad? Reaper asked. Stone looked at Elena, who was drifting in and out of consciousness. Looked at Diego and Miguel, clinging to each other in terror. Thought about 3 grown men beating a defenseless woman for the crime of standing up for herself. Bad enough, Stone said. They sent a message. Time to send one back. How many we talking? Stone considered this. A show of force needed to be proportional to the injustice, but overwhelming enough to ensure it never happened again. Too few, and it wouldn't be taken seriously. Too many, and it might escalate beyond control. Everyone, Stone said finally. Bring everyone. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then Reaper's voice, steel wrapped in gravel. 1 hour. Full chapter response. And Stone? Yeah. Good work. The Hells Angels had been founded on the principle that brotherhood meant more than shared interests or common backgrounds. It meant a willingness to ride into danger for people you might never meet, to stand up against injustice even when it cost you something, to be the kind of man who showed up when showing up mattered. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you're enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. In the 60 minutes that followed Stone's phone call, that principle was about to be tested in ways that would ripple through Millfield for years to come. The ambulance arrived first, paramedics who'd seen enough workplace violence to recognize the signs immediately. They worked with professional efficiency, checking Elena's vital signs, stabilizing her neck, preparing her for transport to Desert Regional Medical Center 15 miles away. "Is she going to be okay?" Diego asked one of the paramedics, a kind-faced woman who reminded him of his third-grade teacher. "Your mom is tough," the paramedic said, and something in her voice made Diego believe it. "She's going to need some time to heal, but she's going to be okay." As the ambulance pulled away, Stone stayed with the boys. The police had taken their statements, photographed the scene, and begun the process of building a case against Tank Morrison and his associates. But Stone knew that justice through the courts was a slow and uncertain process, and sometimes the message needed to be delivered more directly. At 6:47 p.m., as the sun was setting behind the factory buildings and the temperature was dropping into the 50s, a sound began to build in the distance. It started as a low rumble, barely distinguishable from the evening traffic on the highway. But it grew steadily louder, deeper, more distinct. The thunder of motorcycles, many motorcycles, moving in formation toward Miller's textile factory. Stone checked his watch and smiled grimly. Reaper had promised 1 hour, and the Hells Angels were nothing if not punctual. They came from every direction. Desert chapter, mountain chapter, even some members from the Phoenix metropolitan area who dropped everything to make the ride. 60 motorcycles in total, their engines creating a symphony of controlled power that echoed off the factory walls like a gathering storm. Diego and Miguel watched in amazement as the bikes filled the parking lot, forming precise lines that spoke of military discipline and shared purpose. These weren't random troublemakers or weekend rebels. These were men and women who'd answered a call to action, who'd ridden dozens of miles to stand up for someone they'd never met. At the center of the formation was Reaper himself, riding a massive black and chrome Harley that looked like it had been forged in the fires of righteous anger. He was tall and lean, with silver hair pulled back in a ponytail and arms covered in tattoos that told the story of a life lived on the margins of society. But there was something in his bearing, in the way the other riders looked to him for guidance, that suggested a man accustomed to command. Reaper dismounted and walked over to where Stone was standing with the boys. The two men clasped hands in the kind of greeting that spoke of years of shared brotherhood and mutual respect. "Report," Reaper said simply. Stone filled him in on the details. Elena's complaint about wage theft, the retaliation beating, the 3 supervisors who'd driven away laughing after leaving a mother unconscious in front of her children. With each detail, Reaper's expression grew harder, more focused. "Where are they now?" Reaper asked. "Gone for the day," Stone said. "But they'll be back tomorrow morning. Factory starts up at 6 a.m. Reaper nodded, then knelt down so he was at eye level with Diego and Miguel. His voice, when he spoke to them, was surprisingly gentle. "Boys, I'm sorry about what happened to your mama. That was wrong, and we're going to make sure it doesn't happen again. But first, I need you to tell me exactly what you saw. Can you do that?" Diego stepped forward, still holding his brother's hand. 3 men hurt Mama, Tank and Jerry, and Danny. They said she made trouble, but Mama just wanted to be paid for her work. That's not trouble. That's fair. You're absolutely right. Reaper said, "That is fair. And what happened to your mama was not fair. We're going to fix that." Miguel wiped his nose on his sleeve. "Are you going to hurt them like they hurt Mama?" Reaper considered the question seriously. "Son, there are different kinds of hurt. Sometimes people need to understand that their actions have consequences. That's what we're here to teach them." Behind them, the other riders were dismounting and organizing themselves with the efficiency of people who'd done this many times before. But there was something different about this gathering and electricity in the air that spoke of barely contained fury, of men and women who'd seen too much injustice to stand by and watch it happen again. Among the riders were people from all walks of life. Tommy Wrench Martinez, a master mechanic who owned 3 auto shops across the valley. Sarah Butterfly Chan, a registered nurse who'd ridden straight from her shift at the Children's Hospital. Big Jim Sullivan, Reaper's younger brother, who taught high school, mathematics, and coached the football team. These weren't society's outcasts, they were society's backbone, united by a code that valued loyalty and justice above comfort and convenience. As the sun disappeared behind the factory buildings and the parking lot was illuminated by the rider's headlights, Reaper called for attention. 60 voices fell silent, waiting for his words. "Brothers and sisters," Reaper said, his voice carrying across the lot like a sermon. "We're here because a working mother was beaten unconscious for standing up for her rights. We're here because 2 little boys had to watch their mama bleed, because she dared to demand fair pay for honest work." He gestured toward the factory building, where security lights were beginning to flicker on. This place has been stealing from its workers for months, taking food off their tables, money from their children's mouths. And when one brave woman tried to stop it, they tried to break her. The anger in the crowd was palpable, but it was controlled anger, focused and purposeful rather than chaotic. "We're not here for revenge," Reaper continued. "We're here for justice. We're here to send a message that working people deserve dignity, that mothers deserve protection, that children deserve to grow up in a world where doing the right thing doesn't get you beaten in a parking lot." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Tomorrow morning, when those supervisors come to work, they're going to find us waiting. And we're going to have a conversation about respect, about consequences, and about what happens when you mess with the wrong family." The response was a rumble of approval that seemed to shake the ground beneath their feet. Stone stepped forward. "What about the boys?" he asked, nodding toward Diego and Miguel, who were watching the proceedings with wide eyes. "They're coming with us," Reaper said. "Their mama's in the hospital, and they shouldn't be alone. Butterfly, can you arrange for someone to watch them tonight?" Sarah Chin, the nurse, stepped forward. "My sister lives 10 minutes from here. She's got 3 kids of her own. They'll be safe." As the riders began to settle in for what would be a long night of waiting, Diego tugged on Stone's leather vest. "Mr. Stone," the boy said, "are you really going to help Mama?" Stone knelt down and put his hand on Diego's shoulder. "Son, your mama stood up for what was right, even when it was dangerous. That takes more courage than most people ever find. We're going to make sure that courage gets the respect it deserves." Miguel stepped closer. "Will Mama be proud of us?" "Your mama's already proud of you," Stone said. "But tomorrow, she's going to be proud of a lot more people than just her boys." As the night wore on, the riders took turns keeping watch, sharing stories, and preparing for the confrontation that would come with the sunrise. Some cleaned their bikes. Others checked their phones for messages from loved ones. A few played cards under the parking lot lights. But all of them shared the same sense of purpose, the knowledge that they were exactly where they needed to be, doing exactly what they were meant to do. At 5:47 a.m., as the eastern sky was beginning to lighten with the promise of dawn, the first factory workers began arriving for the day's shift. They stared in amazement at the 60 motorcycles still parked in formation, at the leather-clad figures who'd spent the night in the cold October air. Word spread quickly through the workforce. The Hells Angels were at the factory. Something big was about to happen. At exactly 6 a.m., Tank Morrison's pickup truck pulled into the parking lot. He stepped out, saw the motorcycles, and his face went pale. Jerry Kowalski and Danny Martinez arrived moments later, their own expressions shifting from confusion to fear as they realized what they were facing. The 3 men huddled together near the factory entrance, whispering urgently. They could try to call the police, but what crime was being committed? They could try to hide inside the factory, but eventually they'd have to come out. They could try to leave, but that would only delay the inevitable. Reaper started his motorcycle. The sound was like a signal, and one by one, the other engines roared to life. 60 Harleys, creating a wall of sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of Miller's textile factory. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the noise stopped. In the sudden silence, Reaper dismounted and walked toward the 3 supervisors. He wasn't hurrying. He wasn't threatening. He was simply a man with something important to say, walking across a parking lot in the early morning light. Behind him, 59 other riders dismounted and followed. Tank Morrison was 6 feet tall and weighed 280 pounds. He'd spent his entire adult life intimidating people through size and aggression. But faced with 60 people who'd ridden through the night to confront him, he suddenly looked very small. "We need to talk," Reaper said when he reached the 3 men. His voice was calm, conversational, but it carried an undertone of absolute authority that made further resistance seem pointless. What was said in the conversation that followed, no one recorded. There were no cameras, no witnesses outside the Brotherhood, no official transcript. But the results spoke for themselves. By 7 a.m., Tank Morrison, Jerry Kowalski, and Danny Martinez had submitted their resignations to factory management. By 8 a.m., they'd returned all stolen wages to the affected workers with interest calculated at rates that ensured they'd think twice before stealing again. By 9 a.m., they'd personally apologized to every worker they'd cheated and publicly acknowledged Elena Vasquez's courage in standing up to their corruption. And by 10 a.m., they'd left Millfield permanently, with the understanding that their return would not be welcomed by anyone in the community. But the Hells Angels weren't finished. Reaper and Stone drove to Desert Regional Medical Center, where Elena was recovering from a concussion and 3 broken ribs. They found her in room 247, sitting up in bed despite the doctor's orders, worried sick about her boys. "Mrs. Vasquez," Reaper said as he entered the room, "my name is James Sullivan. I believe you know my associate, Marcus Rodriguez." Elena looked confused, still groggy from pain medication. "I don't understand. Where are Diego and Miguel? Are they safe?" "Your boys are fine," Stone assured her. "They're with good people. But we need to talk to you about what happened yesterday." Elena's eyes filled with tears. "I just wanted fair pay. I just wanted what I'd earned. I never meant for this to happen." "Ma'am," Reaper said gently, "you did nothing wrong. You stood up for yourself and your fellow workers. That takes courage. But courage sometimes comes with a price." He reached into his jacket and pulled out an envelope. "This is from the Jai Brotherhood. Medical bills are covered. Lost wages are covered. And there's enough for you and the boys to make a fresh start wherever you want." Elena stared at the envelope, afraid to touch it. "I can't accept charity. I work for what I have." "This isn't charity," Stone said. "This is justice. Your courage saved every worker in that factory from continued theft. That deserves recognition." Elena opened the envelope with trembling hands. Inside were checks totaling $47,000, enough to pay her medical bills, cover her lost wages, and provide security for her family's future. "Why?" she whispered. "You don't even know me." Reaper pulled up a chair beside her bed. "Mrs. Vasquez, we live by a code. We protect those who can't protect themselves. We stand up for people who stand up for what's right. Yesterday, you showed more courage than most people find in a lifetime. Today, we're showing you what that courage is worth." Elena was crying now, but they were different tears than she'd shed in the factory parking lot. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope for a future that had seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. "Your boys saw everything," Stone said quietly. "They saw their mother get hurt for doing what was right. But they also saw justice prevail. They saw that good people exist and that courage gets rewarded. That's a lesson that will shape the rest of their lives." 3 months later, Elena graduated from a paralegal training program, funded by a scholarship from the Hells Angels Community Outreach Foundation. She took a job with the Arizona Department of Labor, investigating workplace violations and fighting for workers' rights across the state. Diego and Miguel grew up knowing that their mother was a hero, that standing up for what's right sometimes costs you something, but it's always worth it. They learned that the world contains both cruelty and kindness, but that kindness, when organized and determined, is always stronger. And every year on October 15th, 60 motorcycles would ride past their new house, a reminder, a promise, a brotherhood that never forgets. Sometimes the people who look most dangerous are the ones willing to ride into danger for people they've never met. Sometimes the thunder of engines isn't a threat. It's the sound of justice rolling down the highway, powered by people who believe that everyone deserves dignity, protection, and the chance to stand up for what's right without fear. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs to remember that good people still exist. That standing up for what's right matters. That brotherhood isn't about blood, it's about choosing to protect those who can't protect themselves. Tell us in the comments. Have you ever witnessed someone stand up for what's right when it cost them something? Because that's how the world changes, not through grand gestures or headlines, but through ordinary people making extraordinary choices. In moments that matter. One act of courage at a time. One stand for justice at a time. One family protected at a time. That's how we save each other. That's how we save ourselves. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.